Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Book Club with Jared podcast. My name is Jared. I will be your host for the duration of this podcast. Before we get started, I want to tell you about sort of how this idea came to fruition, because this podcast has been sort of a brainchild of mine for quite a while. It just took a while to sort of execute it. I believe it all started back in elementary school. I can't remember entirely when, but you know how you would be sitting in class at the end of the day, towards the end of the day, at least for me, and your teacher would say, "All right, class, it's time for book reading time." That was always like my jam. Like, I loved book reading time. And that was when the teacher would get up in front of the class and she or he, whoever your teacher was, would read some big book. And that was just so much fun, listening and letting your imagination run wild with the story that she was telling. And I don't know how they did it, but our teachers always managed to pick the most interesting and fun books to read. And that's sort of what I want to do for you guys. I feel like in this digital age of technology and smartphones and the internet and so forth, reading books as a leisurely pastime has become sort of a lost art. I feel like it's not really something that people do anymore. At least not many people that I know personally. So I want to instill in all of you the joy that I got out of reading books as a kid. I used to read a lot, and over these past few months I've been reading more and more and more, and I thought to myself a while ago, hey, I could turn this into a podcast. I could make this into something that people would look forward to, something that people can, come home at the end of the day and listen to, or listen to while they're driving to work, or that sort of thing. If you can't already tell, I have really big goals and high hopes for this show. So I'm really hoping that you guys will stick around and listen to me read to you. Basically, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to select a book, and each and every episode I'm going to read some duration. I'm thinking that I'll read maybe 2 or 3 chapters of a book, and after which I will discuss what we read and what I liked about it and that sort of thing. Basically everything that a book club does. So since this is the first ever episode, there's obviously going to be some kinks to iron out and things that I can improve on, and I would really appreciate it if you guys would let me know what those things are, what you enjoyed, what you think I could work on. I'm hoping to start a Twitter for it and an Instagram as well, so that you guys can sort of you guys can play a part in what's going on here. I'm always open to recommendations for good books to read. I have one here today, and I'll get into that in a minute. So every episode I'm going to try and have some sort of theme. I don't have that part completely ironed out yet, but I'm going to come up with it. I'm going to get it down, and this is going to be a fun project. At the end of every episode, if there are any, I'm going to give any announcements that I have, like about future projects or later episodes or that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that after the actual reading part, or don't. I can't really tell you what to do, but a little bit about me. My name is Jared. I live in a small town in Washington State called Port Orchard. I have a very humble abode. I live by myself in a little apartment. I have a lot of fun here. I got all I need. I have food. I have heat. I have a really cool couch. I wish you guys could see that, but that's sort of besides the point. So, without any further ado, I think we can get into the book now. It's enough talking and introduction. What I've selected for the first book that we're going to read is one of my personal favorites. I discovered this book a while ago at a used bookstore in town. It's the first book in the Alex Rider series. It's called Stormbreaker. And what I like about this book is that it's a great story. Apparently they made it into a movie, which I didn't know about, but and there's a series about it on Amazon Prime, which Spotify ads never fail to tell me about. But it's a good book. I really like it. I believe there's about 12 books in the series, so we'll have a lot of work cut out for us in this one. And I chose this book because I'm about 98% sure that there's no profanity in it and that sort of thing, because that's what I want. I want to make this a family-friendly environment where people can, listen, and kids and people of all ages can listen to. And that's actually the reason why this show is taking so long, because I've already recorded 4 episodes of books that I was blindly getting into, and they had a bit of profanity in it, and I don't want to be labeled like, hey, he's reading books that are inappropriate, and I want to cater to all audiences. And so I've chosen Stormbreaker. It's by an author named Anthony Horowitz, and I've read a few of these books in the series, so I'm just starting over because, good book you can read multiple times. It seems like the chapters are pretty short, so I think I'll read the first 3. In this book there are 17, with a total of 234 pages. And there's an epilogue at the end, which is the beginning of the next book, so I'll read that as well. So I'm going to get into this, and when I do the next episode, I might have some tea or something to add to the aesthetic, because, tea and books is just sort of a vibe, All right, so here we go. All right, Chapter 1, Funeral Voices. When the doorbell rings at 3 a.m, it's never good news. Alex Rider was woken by the first chime. His eyes flickered open, but for a moment, he stayed completely still in his bed, lying on his back with his head resting on the pillow. He heard a bedroom door open and a creak of wood as somebody went downstairs. The bell rang a second time, and he looked at the alarm clock glowing beside him. There was a rattle as somebody slid the security chain off the front door. He rolled out of bed and walked over to the open window, his bare feet pressing down the carpet pile. The moonlight spilled onto his chest and shoulders. Alex was 14, already well built, with the body of an athlete. His hair, cut short, apart from his 2 thick strands hanging over his forehead, was fair. His eyes were brown and serious. For a moment, he stood silently, half hidden in the window, looking out. There was a police car parked outside. From his second-floor window, Alex could see the black ID number on the roof and the caps of the 2 men who were standing in front of the door. The porch light went on, and in the same time, the door opened. "Miss Rider?" "No, I'm the housekeeper. What is it? What's happened?" "This is the home of Mr. Ian Rider?" "Yes." "I wonder if we could come in." And Alex already knew. He knew from the way the police stood there, awkward and unhappy. He also knew from the tone in their voices. Funeral voices. That was how he would describe them later. The sort of voices people use when they come to tell you that somebody close to you has died. He went to his door and opened it. He could hear the two policemen talking down the hall, but only some of the words reached him. A car accident. Called the ambulance. Intensive care. Nothing anyone could do. So sorry. It was only hours later, sitting in the kitchen, waiting as the gray light of the morning bled slowly through the West London streets, that Alex could try to make sense of what had happened. His uncle, Ian Rider, was dead. Driving home, his car had been hit by a truck at Old Street roundabout, and he had been killed almost instantly. He hadn't been wearing a seatbelt, the police said, otherwise he might have had a chance. Alex thought of the man who had been his only relation for as long as he could remember. He had never known his own parents. They had both died in another accident. This one a plane crash, a few weeks after he had been born. He had been brought up by his father's brother, never Uncle Ian Rider. Had hated that word. And had spent most 14 years in the same terraced house in Chelsea, London, between the King's Road and the river. I believe that's the River Thames. The two of them had always been close. Alex remembered the vacations they'd taken together, the many sports they'd played, the movies they'd seen. They hadn't just been relations, they'd been friends. It was almost impossible to imagine that he would never see the man again, hear his laughter, or twist his arm to get help with his science homework. Alex sighed, fighting against the sense of grief that it was suddenly overwhelming. For what saddened him the most was the realization, too late now, that despite everything, he had already known his uncle at all. He had hardly known his uncle at all. He was a banker. People said Alex looked a little like him. Ian Rider was always traveling. A quiet, private man who liked good wine, classical music, and books. Funny. Who didn't seem to have any girlfriends. In fact, he didn't seem to have many friends at all. He'd kept himself fit, had never smoked, and had dressed expensively. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't a picture of a life. It was only a thumbnail sketch. Are you all right, Alex? A young woman had come into the room. She was in her late 20s with a sprawl of red hair and a round, boyish face. Jack Starbright was American. She had come to London as a student 7 years ago, rented a room in the house, in return for light housework and babysitting duties, and had stayed on to become housekeeper and one of Alex's closest companions. Sometimes he wondered what the Jack was short for. Jackie? Jacqueline? Neither of them suited her, and although he had once asked, she had never said. Alex nodded. What do you think will happen? He asked. What do you mean? To the house, to me, to you. I don't know, she shrugged. I guess Ian would have made a will, she said. He'll have left instructions. Maybe we should look in his office. Yeah, but not today, Alex. Let's take it one step at a time. Ian's office was a room running the full length of the house, high up on the top. It was the only room that was always locked. Alex had only ever been in there 3 or 4 times, and never on his own. When he was younger, he had fantasized that there might be something strange up there, a time machine or a UFO. But it was merely an office with a desk and a couple of filing cabinets, shelves full of papers and books, bank stuff. That's what Ian said. Even so, Alex wanted to go up there now. The police said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. Alex turned to look at Jack. She nodded. Yeah, that's what they said. Doesn't that seem strange to you? You know how careful he was. He always wore his seatbelt. He wouldn't even drive me around the corner without making me put mine on. Jack thought for a moment and then shrugged. Yeah, it is strange, she said. But that must have been the way it was. Why would the police have lied? The day dragged on. Alex hadn't gone to school even though, secretly, he wanted to. He would have preferred to escape back into normal life. The clang of the bell, the sounds of familiar faces, the crowds of familiar faces, instead of sitting here, trapped inside the house. But he had to be there for the visitors who came throughout the morning and the rest of the afternoon. There were 5 of them. A lawyer who knew nothing about any will but seemed to have been charged with organizing the funeral. A funeral director who had been recommended by the lawyer. A vicar, tall, elderly, who seemed disappointed that Alex refused to cry. A neighbor from across the road. How did she even know that anyone had died? And finally, a man from the bank. All of us at the Royal and General are deeply shocked, he said. He looked about 30, wearing a polyester suit with a Marks and Spencer tie. He had the sort of face you forget even while you're looking at it, and had introduced himself as Crawley, from the personal. But if there's anything we can do... What will happen? Asked for a second time that day. You don't have to worry, Crawley said. The bank will take care of everything. That's my job. You leave everything to me. The day passed. Alex killed a couple of hours knocking a few balls around his uncle's snooker table, and then felt vaguely guilty when Jack caught him at it. But what else was he going to do? Later on, she took him to a Burger King. He was glad to get out of the house, but the two of them barely spoke. Alex assumed Jack would have to go back to America. She certainly couldn't stay in London forever. So who would look after him? At 14, he was still too young to look after himself. His whole future looked so uncertain that he preferred not to talk about it. He preferred not to talk at all. And then the day of the funeral arrived, and Alex found himself dressed in a dark black jacket and cords, preparing to leave in a black car that had come from nowhere, surrounded by people he had never met. Ian Rider was buried in Brompton Cemetery on the Fulham Road, just in the shadow of the Chelsea soccer field, and Alex knew where he would have preferred to be on that warm Wednesday afternoon. About 30 people had turned up, but he hardly recognized any of them. A grave had been dug close to the lane that ran the length of the cemetery, and as the service began, a black Rolls Royce drew up. The black door opened and a man got out. Alex watched him as he walked forward and stopped. Alex shivered. There was something about the new arrival that made his skin crawl. And yet, the man was ordinary to look at. Gray suit, gray hair, gray lips, and gray eyes. His face was expressionless, the eyes behind the square gunmetal spectacles completely empty. Perhaps that was what had disturbed Alex. Whoever this man was, he seemed to have less life than anyone in the cemetery, above or below ground. Someone tapped Alex on the shoulder, and he turned around to see Mr. Crawley leaning over him. That's Mr. Blunt, the personal manager whispered. He's the chairman of the bank. Alex's eyes traveled past Blunt and over to the Rolls Royce. Two more men had come with him, one of them driving. They were wearing identical suits and, although it wasn't a particularly bright day, sunglasses. Both of them were watching the funeral with the same grim faces. Alex looked from them to Blunt and then to the other people who had come to the cemetery. Had they really known Ian Rider? Why had he never met any of them before? And why did he find it so difficult to believe that they really worked for a bank? A good man, a patriotic man, he will be missed. The vicar had finished his graveside address. His choice of words struck Alex as odd. Patriotic? That meant he loved his country. But as far as Alex knew, Ian Rider had barely spent any time in it. Certainly he had never been one for waving the Union Jack. The Union Jack, for anyone who doesn't know, is the flag of England. He looked around, hoping to see Jack, but saw instead that Blunt was making his way toward him, stepping carefully around the grave. You must be Alex. The chairman was only a little taller than him. Up close, his skin was strangely unreal. It could have been made of plastic. My name is Alan Blunt, he said. Your uncle often spoke about you. That's funny, Alex said. He never mentioned you. The gray lips twitched briefly. We'll miss him. He was a good man. What was he good at? Alex asked. He never talked about his work. Suddenly, Crawley was there. Your uncle was overseas finance manager, Alex. He was responsible for our foreign branches. You must have known that. I know he traveled a lot, Alex said, and I know he was very careful about things like seatbelts. Well, sadly, he wasn't careful enough. Blunt's eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles, lasered into his own, and for a moment, Alex felt himself pinned down, like an insect under a microscope. I hope we'll meet again, Blunt went on. He tapped on the side of his face with a single gray finger. Yes. Then he turned and went back to his car. That was when it happened. As Blunt was getting into the Rolls Royce, the driver leaned down to open the back door, and his jacket fell open, revealing a stark white shirt underneath. There was a black shape lying against it, and that's what caught Alex's eye. The man was wearing a leather holster with an automatic pistol strapped inside. Realizing what had happened, the driver quickly straightened up and pulled the jacket across. Blunt had seen it too. He looked back and looked again at Alex. Sorry, I stuttered there. Something very close to an emotion slithered over his face. Then he got into the car, the door closed, and he was gone. A gun at a funeral, Alex thought. Why? Why should bank managers carry guns? Let's get out of here. Suddenly, Jack was at his side. Cemeteries give me the creeps. Yes, and quite a few creeps have turned up, Alex muttered. They slipped away quietly and went home. The car that had taken them to the funeral was still waiting, but they preferred the open air. The walk took them 15 minutes and they turned a corner onto their street. Alex noticed a moving van parked in front of the house. The words Stryker and Son painted on the side. What's that doing? He began. At the same moment, the van shot off, the wheels skidding over the surface of the road. Alex said nothing as Jack unlocked the door and let them in. But while she went into the kitchen to make some tea, he quickly looked around the house. A letter that had been on the hall table now lay on the carpet. A door that had been half open was now closed. Tiny details, but Alex's eyes missed nothing. Somebody had been in the house. He was almost sure of it. But he wasn't certain until he got to the top floor. The door to the office, which had always been locked, was now unlocked. Alex opened it and went in. The room was empty. Ian Rider had gone, and so had everything else. The desk drawers, the closets, the shelves, anything connected to the dead man's work had been taken. Whatever the truth was about his uncle's past, someone had just wiped it out. It's a really good first chapter. I like that a lot. So, not to spoil it, but this is important, obviously. It's the first chapter, and why everything was taken will make sense later in the book. So here we go for chapter 2, Heaven for Cars. These chapters have titles, by the way. With Hammersmith Bridge just ahead of them, Alex felt the river and swung his bike through the lights and down the hill towards Brooklyn School. The bike was a Condor Junior road racer, custom built for him on his 12th birthday. It was a teenager's bike, with a cut-down Reynolds 531 frame, but the wheels were full-sized, so he could ride at its speed with hardly any rolling resistance. He spun past a delivery man and passed through the school gates. He would be sorry when he grew out of the bike. For 2 years now, it had almost become a part of him. He double-locked it in the shed and went into the yard. Brooklyn was a modern school, all red brick and, to Alex's eye, rather ugly. He could have gone to any of the exclusive private schools around Chelsea, but Ian Rider had decided to send him here. He had said it would be more of a challenge. The first period of the day was algebra. When Alex came into the classroom, the teacher, Mr. Donovan, was already chalking up the complicated equation on the board. It was hot in the room, the sun streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, put in by architects who should have known better. As Alex took his place near the back, he wondered how he was going to get through the lesson. How could he possibly think about algebra when there were so many other questions churning through his mind? The gun at the funeral, the way that Blunt had looked at him, the van with the Stryker and Son written on the side, the empty office, and the biggest mystery of all, the one detail that refused to go away, the seatbelt. Ian Rider had been wearing a seatbelt. But of course he had. Ian Rider had never been one to give lectures. He had always said Alex should make up his own mind about things, but he had had his thing about seatbelts. The more Alex thought about it, the less he believed it. A collision in the middle of the city. Suddenly, he wished he could see the car. At least the wreckage would tell him that the accident had really happened. that Ian Ryder really died that way. Alex? Alex looked up and realized that everybody was staring at him. Mr. Donovan had just asked him something. He quickly scanned the chalkboard and the figures. Yes, sir, he said. X equals 7 and Y is 15. The math teacher sighed. Yes, Alex, you're absolutely right. But actually, I was just asking you to open the window. Somehow he managed to get through the rest of the day, but by the time the final bell rang, his mind was made up. While everybody else streamed out, he made his way to the secretary's office and borrowed a copy of the Yellow Pages. What are you looking for? The secretary asked. Miss Bedfordshire had always had a soft spot for Alex. Auto junkyards. Alex flipped through the pages. If a car got smashed up near Old Street, they would take it somewhere near, wouldn't they? I suppose so. Here. Alex had found the yards listed under auto wreckers, but there were dozens of them fighting for attention over 4 pages. Is this for a school project? The secretary asked. She knew Alex had lost a relative, but not how. Sort of. Alex was reading the addresses, but they told him nothing. This one's quite near Old Street, Miss Bedfordshire pointed at the corner of the page. Wait! Alex tucked the book toward him and looked at the entry underneath the one the secretary had chosen. J.B. Stryker Auto Wreckers. Heaven for cars. Call us today. That's in Vauxhall, Miss Bedfordshire said. Not too far from here. I know, Alex had recognized the name. J.B. Stryker. He thought back to the van he had seen outside the house on the day of the funeral. Stryker and Son. Of course it might be just a coincidence, but it was still somewhere to start. He closed the book. I'll see you, Miss Bedfordshire. Be careful. The secretary watched Alex leave, wondering why she had just said that. Maybe it was his eyes, dark and serious. There was something dangerous there. Then the telephone rang, and she forgot him, and she went back to work. J.B. Stryker's was a square of wasteland behind the railway tracks running up out of Waterloo Station. The area was enclosed by a high brick wall topped with broken glass and razor wire. 2 wooden gates hung open, and from the other side of the road, Alex could see a shed with a security window, and beyond it, tottering piles of dead and broken cars. Everything of any value had been stripped away, and only the rusting carcasses remained, heaped one on top of the other, waiting to be fed into the crusher. There was a guard sitting on the shed, reading a newspaper. In the distance, a bulldozer coughed into life, and then roared down on a battered Ford Taurus, its metal claw smashing through the window to scoop up the vehicle and carry it away. A telephone rang somewhere in the shed, and the guard turned around to answer it. That was not enough for Alex. Holding his bike and wheeling it around beside him, he sprinted through the gates. He found himself surrounded by dirt and debris. The smell of diesel was thick in the air, and the roar of engines was deafening. Alex watched as a crane swooped down on one of the cars, seized it in a metallic grip, and dropped it into a crusher. For a moment, the car rested on the pair of shelves. Then the shelves lifted up, toppling the car over and down into a trough. The operator, sitting in a glass cabin at one end of the crusher, pressed a button, and there was a great belch of black smoke. The shelves closed in on the car like a monster insect folding in its wings. There was a grinding sound, and the car was crushed until it was no bigger than a rolled-up carpet. Then the operator threw a gear, and the car was squeezed out, metallic toothpaste being chopped up by a hidden blade. The slices trembled to the ground. Leaving his bike propped against the wall, Alex ran further into the yard, crouching down behind the wrecks. With the din from the machines, there was no chance that anyone would hear him, but he was still afraid of being seen. He stopped to catch his breath, drawing a grimy hand across his face. His eyes were watering from the diesel fumes. The air was as filthy as the ground beneath him. He was beginning to regret coming, but then he saw it. His uncle's BMW was parked a few yards away, separated from the other cars. At first glance, it looked absolutely fine. The metallic silver bodywork had not even been scratched. Certainly there was no way that this car could have been involved in a fatal collision with a truck or with anything else. It was definitely his uncle's car. Alex recognized the license plate. He hurried closer, and it was now that he saw that the car was damaged after all. The windshield had been smashed, along with all the windows on the driver's side. Alex made his way around to the other side and froze. Ian Rider hadn't died in any accident. What had killed him was plain to see, even to somebody who had never seen such a thing before. A spray of bullets had caught the car full on the driver's side, shattering the front tire, smashing the windshield and side windows, and punching into the side panels. Alex ran his fingers over the holes. The metal felt cold against his flesh. He opened the door and looked inside. The front seats, pale gray leather, were strewn with fragments of broken glass and stained with patches of dark brown. He didn't need to ask what the stain was. He could see everything. The flash of the machine gun, the bullets rippling into the car, Ian Rider jerking the driver's seat. But why? Why kill a bank manager? And why had the murder been covered up? It was the police who had delivered the news that night, so they must be part of it. Had they lied deliberately? None of it made sense. You should have gotten rid of it 2 days ago. Do it now. The machines must have stopped for a moment. If there hadn't been a sudden lull, Alex would never have heard the men coming. Quickly, he looked across the steering wheel and out the other side. There were 2 of them, both dressed in loose-fitting overalls. Alex had a feeling he'd seen them before, at the funeral. One of them was the driver, the man he had seen with a gun. He was sure of it. Whoever they were only paces away from the car, talking in low voices. Another few steps and they would be there. Without thinking, Alex threw himself into the only hiding place available, inside the car itself. Using his foot, he hooked the door and closed it. At the same time, he became aware that the machines had started again, and he could no longer hear the men. He didn't dare look up. A shadow fell across the window as the 2 men passed, but then they were gone. He was safe. And then something hit the BMW with such force that Alex cried out. His whole body caught in a massive shockwave that tore him away from the steering wheel and threw him helplessly into the back. The roof buckled and 3 huge metal fingers tore through the skin of the car like a fork through an eggshell, trailing dust in sunlight. One of the fingers grazed the side of his head. Any closer and it would have cracked his skull. Alex yelled as blood trickled over his eye. He tried to move, then was jerked back a second time as the car was yanked off the ground and tilted high in the air. He couldn't see, he couldn't move, but his stomach lurched as the car swung in an arc. The metal grinding and the light spinning, the BMW had been picked up by the crane. It was going to be put inside the crusher, with him inside. He tried to raise himself up, to wave through the windows, but the claw of the crane had already flattened the roof, pinning his left leg, perhaps even breaking it. He could feel nothing. He lifted a hand and managed to pound on the back window, but he couldn't break the glass. Even if the workmen were staring at the BMW, they would never see anything moving inside. His short flight across the junkyard ended with a bone-shattering crash as the crane deposited the car on the iron shelves of the crusher. Alex tried to fight back his sickness and despair and think of what to do. Any moment now, the operator would send the car tipping into the coffin-shaped trough. The machine was a Lefort shear, a slow-motion guillotine. At the press of a button, the 2 wings would close on the car with a joint pressure of 500 tons. The car, with Alex inside it, would be crushed beyond recognition, and the broken metal and flesh would then be chopped into sections. Nobody would ever know what had happened. He tried with all of his strength to free himself, but the roof was too low. His leg was trapped, and then his whole world tilted and he felt himself falling into darkness. The shelves had lifted, the BMW slid into one side and fell, and the few yards in the trough. Alex felt the metalwork collapsing all around him. The back window exploded and glass showered around his head. Dust and diesel fumes punching into his nose and eyes. There was hardly any daylight now, but looking out the back, he could see the huge steel head of the piston that would soon push what was left of the car through the exit hole on the other side. The engine tone of the Lefort shear changed as it prepared for the final act. The metal wings shuddered. In a few seconds' time, the 2 of them would meet, crumpling the BMW like a paper bag. Alex pulled with all of his strength and was astonished when his leg came free. It took him perhaps a second. one precious second to work out what had happened. When the car had fallen into the trough, it had landed on its side. The roof had buckled again, just enough to free him. His hands scrabbled for the door, but of course, that was useless. The doors were too bent. They would never open. The back window! With the glass gone, he could crawl through the frame, but only if he moved fast. The wings began to move. The BMW screamed as the two walls of solid steel relentlessly crushed it. More glass shattered. One of the wheel axles snapped with the sound of a thunderbolt. Darkness began to close in. Alex grabbed hold of what was left of the back seat. Ahead of him, he could see a single triangle of light, shrinking faster and faster. He could feel the weight of the two walls pressing down on him. The car was no longer a car, but the fist of some hideous monster, snatching at the insect that Alex had become. With all of his strength, he surged forward. His shoulders passed through the triangle, out into the light. Next came his legs. But at the last moment, his shoe caught on a piece of jagged metal. He jerked, and the shoe was pulled off, falling back into the car. Alex heard the sound of the leather being squashed. Finally, clinging to the black, oily surface of the observation platform at the back of the crusher, he dragged himself clear and managed to stand up. He found himself face to face with a man so fat that he could barely fit into the small cabin of the crusher. The man's stomach was pressed against the glass. His shoulders squeezed into the corners. A cigarette dangled in his lower lip, and his mouth fell open and his eyes stared. What he saw was a boy in the rags of what had once been a school uniform. A whole sleeve had been torn off, and his arm, streaked with blood and oil, hung limply by his side. By the time the operator had taken this all in, come to his senses, and turned the machine off, the boy had gone. Alex clambered down the side of the crusher, landing on one foot that still had a shoe. He was aware now of the pieces of jagged metal lying everywhere. If he wasn't careful, he would cut open the other foot. His bicycle was where he had left it, leaning against the wall and gingerly, half hoping he made for it. Behind him, he heard the cabin of the crusher open and a man's voice called out, raising the alarm. At the same time, a second man ran forward, stopping between Alex and his bike. It was the driver, the man he had seen at the funeral. His face, twisted into a hostile frown, was curiously ugly. Greasy hair, watery eyes, pale, lifeless skin. "What do you think?" he began. His hand slid into his jacket. Alex remembered the gun, and instantly, without even thinking, swung into action. He had started learning karate when he was 6 years old. One afternoon, with no explanation, Ian Rider had taken him into a local club for his first lesson, and he had been going there once a week ever since. Over the years, he had passed through the various Caillou student grades, but it was only the year before he had become a first-grade Dan, a black belt. When he had arrived at Brooklyn's school, his gentle looks and accent had quickly brought him to the attention of the school bullies. 3 hulking 16-year-olds. They had cornered him once behind the bike shed. The encounter lasted less than a minute. The next day, one of the bullies had left Brooklyn, and the other 2 had never troubled anyone again. Now, Alex brought up one leg, twisted his body around, and lashed out. The back kick. The back kick is said to be the most lethal in karate. His foot powered into the man's abdomen with such force that the man didn't even have time to cry out. His eyes bulged and his mouth half opened in surprise. Then, with his hand still halfway into his jacket, he crumpled to the ground. Alex jumped over him, snatched his bike, and swung himself onto it. In the distance, a third man was running toward him. He heard the single word, "Stop," called out. Then there was a crack and a bullet whipped past. Alex gripped the handlebars and pedaled as hard as he could. The bike shot forward, over the rubble and out through the gates. He took one look over his shoulder. Nobody had followed him. With one shoe on and one shoe off, his clothes in rags and his body streaked with oil, Alex knew he must look a strange sight. But then he thought back to his last seconds inside the crusher and sighed with relief. He could be looking a lot worse. That's the end of chapter 2. Okay, so chapter 3 is about 12 pages, and we are running up on about 40 minutes. So I think we're going to stop there for today. The next chapter, chapter 3, is called Royal and General, so that must be important. So far, we've read that Alex, obviously, is a child. He's living in England, in London, by Chelsea, and his uncle has died. We don't entirely know yet how his uncle's died, but Alex has been told that his uncle Ian has died in a car accident. But over the past chapter, we've learned that it was actually a murder, and it's trying to be covered up. And so that's where we are at this point in the book. So we will get back to that on the next episode. We read 26 pages today, so we made some progress. Since this is the first episode, there's obviously no announcements. I'm going to try and upload videos at least twice a week, at most 3. I work a lot, so I may not have time to always do 3 episodes a week, but I'm going to still do my best, and I still have to do all the editing and that sort of thing and all that. But I am really thankful for everybody for tuning in to this first episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you guys on the next episode. All right. Have a great evening, guys. Bye.